Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Going Deeper with Distance Learning, presented by Douglas Fisher, Nancy Frey, and John Hattie. First off, we at Corwin wish health and well-being to all of you and your families and your communities during this difficult time for educators. We're just so happy that you took the time to join us today for some professional development. And just to answer the question, yes, you'll receive access to this recording a little later in the week, along with your professional development certificate. So thanks for joining, and that'll be coming shortly. I ask that you open the chat box and submit your questions and interact with participants using the chat function. Please don't use Q&A, but use chat. And make sure when you use the chat function that you send your questions and comments to all panelists and attendees. And again, this webinar recording, PowerPoint deck, and certificate of attendance will be emailed to you later on in the week. Upcoming webinars. September 30th, Breakthrough Leadership from Surviving to Thriving. October 5th, Practical PBL at a Distance. And October 13th, Youth National Call on School Equity. We look forward to seeing many of you at those meetings. Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dina Meyer, Executive Marketing Manager for Corwin, to introduce today's presenters.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey bring decades of educational experience to their work. They're both professors of educational leadership at San Diego State University, as well as leaders at Health Sciences High and Middle College. Doug has served as a teacher, a language development specialist, administrator in public school and nonprofit organizations, including 8 years as the Director of Professional Development for the City Heights Collaborative. Nancy has been a special education teacher, a reading specialist, and administrator in public schools. She's engaged in professional learning communities as a member and in designing school-wide systems to improve teaching and learning for all students. John Hattie, joining us from Melbourne, Australia, where it's 5 a.m., so extra special thank you for him for getting up so early to join us. John is an education researcher and author with nearly 30 years experience examining what works best in student learning and achievement. His research, known as visible learning, is a meta-analysis of over 95,000 studies involving 300 million students around the world. He has presented and keynoted at over 350 international conferences and has received numerous recognitions for his contributions to education. I ask that each of you stay till the end of the presentation to hear about some additional opportunities to interact with these presenters. And now I'll turn it over to our authors to present Going Deeper with Distance Learning.
Thank you. I'm just super humored with this chat. This is like the best question. I can hardly pay attention to the rest of what you're saying because I love all these amusement rides and all the connections you're all making. Thank you. John, you're on mute.
Yeah. All right, folks, we want to start today by asking you a question about engagement. If I said to you, what do you understand by the notion of engagement? How do you know kids are engaged? I'd love to see some of your comments in the chat, because this is where we want to start in this discussion of moving from a regular in-class to COVID kind of teaching. And here in Australia, we moved to COVID teaching at the start of our school year. So we've had about 9 months of it. We're still out of school. We've been in, we've been out, we've been back again. And one of the questions relates to this notion of engagement. So thank you. Yes, here they come. Active, engaging with the lessons. Yep. Excellent. Look at the responses there.
Awesome.
We did Amy Berry and our team did a study not so long ago where she asked hundreds of teachers, thousands of teachers about their concept of engagement. And the most common comment was engagement is when they are doing. And it's kind of many of your comments coming through. They were doing the task. They were completing the task. And what I think you're going to find with COVID distance learning is that concept of doing in terms of behavioral doing is not going to work. It's not going to be the same. And in that lot of doing, for some students, there isn't much learning. And so what Amy has developed is a different notion of engagement, which we think is a really good way to start this discussion today. Now you can see in the middle there, participating. Yeah, that is the doing part, the paying attention, the responding. But we want our students to move from that to investing, where they are more involved in asking questions, valuing the learning, and ultimately we want to teach them how to move to driving. And certainly on distance learning, that jump from participating to investing in driving is pretty critical. Here, when we first started distance learning across schools, teachers created resources, gave them to students, and expected them to participate by doing them. Yeah, didn't work, massive failure. We don't have them in front of us. We can't look over their shoulders. We can't demand that they pay attention, get on with it, behavioral kind of participation. So they had to move then to how do you create tasks for students where they were taught how to invest and ultimately how they drive. And on the negative side, we all know about the disruptive students. And one of the interesting things you're going to find in at-home COVID teaching is that some of those disruptive kids don't have the same cues, are not going to be as disruptive. But here's the sad news. Those students who are withdrawn, and you know them all. My number 2 son was the perfect one. He went to school for lunch, girls and sport. He knew how to play the game of looking like he knew what he was doing and he didn't do anything. It's kind of ironic that that's the first son who became a teacher, but that's another story. A lot of kids are that withdrawing. The bad news is their profile of learning is not that greatly different from those who are the disruptors. And so looking at those students, and as they go online, whether they're withdrawing, they're avoiding, or they're disrupting, our job is to not get them to necessarily participate, but to get them to move beyond that so they invest. And so this is the model of the first way of thinking about doing distance is how do we change our conception of engagement from engagement is about doing, from engagement is about investing. And here's the good news. We would argue that engagement follows learning, not precedes it. So this notion that you have to come up with real world, authentic, interesting tasks for kids to do so they're engaged, wrong way around. How do we actually get them to make some small steps in learning so they want to come back and do some more? So we move ahead, Doug. And underlying what we're talking about today is very much about how students think. And this is the key argument here. Given we're not going to have so much control in their doing, we want to have more influence on how they think. And we want to start this session by looking at these different student mind frames, these different ways of student thinking. And one of the most powerful things that we've discovered from the distance learning is we interact with our students in a different level. We're going to interact with them much more to understand how they're thinking right now, what's going on in their mind, what they don't understand as well as what they do understand. Whereas in the regular classroom, by age 8, most students learn that it's about sitting up straight, listening to the teacher, doing the work. In distance learning, in COVID learning, no, it's going to be much more about how they're thinking, what their current level of understandings are. So let's look at each of these. So Nancy, you're going to take us through some of these key ways about how students think to allow them to drive.
Thank you, John. And a key part, a really important starting place, as you noted, is that in order for students to be able to engage in that kind of thinking, not doing, they have to know some things about their own current level of understanding. In conventional schooling, there has been an emphasis on the teacher knowing what it is that students can do and not do, what they know and don't know. And of course, that's an important part of the equation. But if students don't also know what their current level of understanding is, then we can't activate the kind of thinking that we want them to be able to do. And there are a couple of different ways to really be able to consider how it is that students can know and understand their current level of knowledge. One of the most important practices is around self-assessment. And we are certainly seeing that in distance learning. We've got to get kids activated around what it is that they're going to be learning. We don't have the opportunities to be able to simply assess all of them and then keep that to ourselves. We have to be able to provide those opportunities for students to engage in their own self-assessment in advance of that unit of study or in advance of that instruction that's going on. One way of doing this, for example, at the school where Doug and I are, one of the things that students have been doing in distance learning is that they are presented with the success criteria for that unit of study. And before they've even engaged in any of that, they're already doing some self-ranking. In other words, if there are 5 levels or 5 different success criteria, they are engaged in thinking about what's going to be among this list of success criteria, the ones that are going to be the easiest for me to do and the ones that I'm going to need a lot more learning in order to be able to reach. That's such valuable feedback for the teacher in terms of pacing. Where can I speed up? Where can I slow down? But it's even more important for students to be able to really engage in what it is that they know and they don't know at that moment. Another important element of helping students to understand their own learning is engaging in conferencing, meeting up with students to be able to talk about what it is that they're doing. Essential, of course, for you to be able to keep those notes, keep those records, but also how is it that you can make sure that students are also coming away from that conferencing with an understanding of where they are. So for example, even doing simple practices, like at the end of a conference, to be able to say to a student, can you summarize for me what you believe that you know now and what it is that you want to be able to accomplish next? And those initial assessments are essential as well. How can we ever know what our impact on student learning is if we don't engage in those initial assessments? Once again, those initial assessments can be utilized so that students gain an understanding of where they are right now. So we're going to ask you a question in the chat, specifically around engagement. How will you know that students know where they are in their learning journey? Really think about this in terms of distance learning. What are some of the practices that you're using so that students know where they are at the beginning of their learning journey? And Katie, I appreciate that, like goal setting, taking polls, exit tickets, those proficiency scales. You know, one of the things I think is really exciting about distance learning is the fact that we know an awful lot about learning, and now we're being challenged in new ways to make sure that learning happens in lots of different ways, in lots across platforms.
I love the chat. It's just really cool. There's so
really
many ideas of people thinking through how will you make sure students know where they are right now in that learning journey. At some point, they have to then know where they're going. So Nancy's point was for you to have a mind frame, and in distance learning, what are the ways we can get students to know, here's where I'm at? Because time becomes less of the variable in distance learning. If a kid needs to have 3 hours to review an asynchronous video, so be it. If a student only needs 1 hour to do an asynchronous video, so be it. But they have to know where they are now, and they have to know where they are going. In part, that reminds us of this work on teacher clarity. Do the teachers know what students need to learn? Do the teachers communicate those learning intentions? And do teachers and students know what success looks like? What does it mean to have learned this? Teacher clarity has a strong influence on learning. It didn't change. In fact, I've even been arguing teacher clarity became more important in distance learning. It's not just compliance tasks. Do I need to learn this? Here's where I'm at. Here's where I'm going. Is this something I need to learn? We wrote these 3 clarity questions, John, Nancy, and I, a little while ago, a couple of years ago, And we want students to be able to answer the question, what am I learning today? Synchronous or asynchronous? Why am I learning this? And how will I know that I have learned it? Now, in our work in our own schools, this third question gets neglected a lot. Students often don't know what success looks like. What they do know is how their teacher will know they've learned it. Because students will often say, I have a project due, I have an essay due, there's an assessment coming up. That's how their teacher will know they've learned it. How do I know that I have learned it? Where's my responsibility in this? So I think in our distance learning, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, students should know, what am I learning today? That's our learning intention. Why am I learning that? That's our relevance. How will I know that I've learned it? That's our success criteria. And if we can do these first two things, if in our distance learning experiences, we can help kids know, here's where I'm at, here's where I'm going. They might actually set goals to accomplish that. They might actually allocate resources, time and attention to accomplishing those goals. So these first two, I think, are super critical in distance learning. How do we create tasks that invite students to vote with their feet, show up at their Zoom meetings, show up on their Canvas page, show up in Seesaw, whichever platforms you use? So a new chat. How could you increase the clarity in your lessons? How can you guarantee students know what it is they're learning, why it is they're learning that, and how they know that they've learned something? An agenda slide, repetition, simplify, I can statements, post it and model it in the agenda, state it, be explicit, communicate it. Post a week at a glance. Awesome. Have kids explain it back to you. Create rubrics, self-assessment tools. I love this chat. It's so cool. I know, Anne, the chat is moving so fast. It's so cool. I hope we're going to know the answer if we get to save the chat, because the chat's pretty awesome. John, selecting tools.
No, I'm like you. I'm watching the chat. It's quite stunning.
It's stunning.
And I want to relay back to what one of the participants said in the chat room. One of the best ways of checking teacher clarity is, can they teach another student? Mm-hmm. And that ultimately has to be the best kind of standard for us. And it's kind of a virtuous circle. Many of us learn tremendously as we prepare to teach something, compared to walking in the room and listening to someone. In distance learning, what an opportunity to have kids involved in teaching each other and coming back and in a sense trying to teach you as the teacher what they've learned, what they've understand, and turning that cycle on its head so the students don't see them as participants for stuff incoming, but they see themselves as involved. So that then leads to this notion about, if they're going to be their own teachers or become their teachers, because I think we have to teach them how to do that, they need to go about being taught how to select tools to guide their learning. They don't have necessarily the same luxury of talking to a student next to them. How are you going about solving this? Putting their hand up in the same ways. Yes, they can do all that online, but how do we teach them to select tools to guide their own learning? We've finished a synthesis of 400 different learning strategies. Yes, there's that many out there. You don't need 400. But unfortunately, some students usually only have one strategy, and they do it, and when it doesn't work, they keep doing it using that strategy and wondering why they're not succeeding. So right now, what an opportunity when they don't have the usual cues, but they're on distance learning, to better understand what tools they're actually selecting and how we can give them other tools to select. For example, move on, Doug. If we look at that PAL, now, let us be clear. We want to teach these skills within history, economics, panel beating, science. We don't want to teach them separately. We want to teach them so, particularly at that moment when a student is struggling, and struggle must be an incredibly positive word. We have to say that Struggle is good. And you're going to find that some of your parents are going to struggle with struggle. They'll think that doing schoolwork is getting it right or wrong. It's not. It's going into that pit of learning. And so we have to say, when kids are struggling, and we want them then to talk about how they're going about solving the problem. And you're going to find that over distance learning, students are going to be much more willing to talk to you on social media about how they're thinking than they do in the regular class. Remember, our students today are very good at social talking to each other, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but that's a power that you're going to find is a really positive one about how they think about their study skill strategies. Douglas, next one. And so when we look at some of those strategies, both in terms of the cognitive skills, so we've just started in that chat, like asking the students to perhaps listen to you as you're talking and take notes. It's fascinating as a teacher to look at the notes they take, how they organize it. Some take it verbatim, not very useful because all their attention is on listening and transcribing. Some can get the big ideas. Some listen to you and get the wrong ideas. It's a very powerful message to hear how students are understanding what you're talking about. And that's a skill that they really need to have, particularly those students who are going to go on to tertiary, into any employment. How do you take notes? How do you summarize? How do they actually go about planning? And getting them to work out a plan before they start. And you may not be with them the whole time in COVID teaching. So what are they going to do when you're not necessarily with them the whole time? Don't just say, go into your room and study. But what's their planning? And what's their monitoring of that planning? And that notion of students being more aware of their concepts about themselves as a learner. And this really critical one of motivation. Too many students come to school because they have to. In COVID teaching, they don't have to come to school in the same way. We have to turn them on to that motivation about it's exciting to learn. And this is why we're so obsessed about giving the students a better understanding of what good, when good's good enough, what success looks like. And maybe in COVID teaching, we might have to give them more steps in the ladder to success criteria so that they have a better sense that, hey, I am learning something. It's exciting to learn this. I want to learn more. And then that's when agency and self-concept come.
Super awesome. And I love your comment about struggle and the whole idea of helping parents become comfortable with struggle was a need that we all talked about, John, Nancy, and I. How do we help parents understand that productive struggle is part of the learning process? And they aren't used to seeing their child struggle for 6.5 hours a day. We are as their teachers. We're okay with that. We scaffold and we check for understanding and we reteach and we prompt and cue. We were so motivated by that that was the genesis of the parent book that John and Nancy and I wrote, is how do we get parents comfortable with struggle and the mind frames that young people need to develop? And they need to create environments for learning and things like that. So we like to say, parents, please allow your kid to struggle. Don't shout out the answers. This is not Jeopardy in your living room. Don't shout out the answers during a Zoom meeting. We are trying to learn things and grappling and thinking through it. So I really appreciate that reminder, John. And so we do have the distance learning playbook for parents written with Rosalind Wiseman. Some of you might know her because her writing previously resulted in a movie called Mean Girls. So the question now, to change the chat around a little bit, how could you increase choice in the learning strategies? And maybe John, you said this earlier, you don't need 100, but you don't need 1. So there's a range, right? So like, do you need 2? Do you need 5? I don't know that I know the answer to that. I know you don't need 100 and certainly not 400, but I worry because I think so many students only are taught one way. This is the way math is done. This is the way writing is done. We all pre-write, then we all draft, then we revise. So I just keep thinking about this. In distance learning, how do we vary the strategies? How do we give them enough to make choices?
I think, Doug, one of the interesting things is us as adults, particularly us as teachers, what do we do when we struggle, when we get stuck? Most of us have alternative ways of doing it. That's what we're talking about. Does your student have an alternative way? And what does it look like? And some of them are really coming through. A lot of the things coming through about how we teach learning strategies. But how do you increase the choice? What's some of the learning strategies? And you said outlining and summarizing. Sometimes it's knowing how to overlearn, deliberately practice.
Super awesome. This
Great
is so
comment.
cool. I'm obsessed with the chat. I'm just like, I keep reading like, oh, that's a good idea. Oh, that's a good idea. I love your chat.
The conversation, John and Doug, that you've been having really kind of slides into this next premise about students being able to seek feedback and recognize that their errors are in fact opportunities to learn. So I'm going to take that apart because there are two important ideas in there. The first is, much like John and Doug have been saying, it's that error part that is essential to the learning process. I think parents as well as sometimes educators wrongly perceive that if a student is making an error, that somehow that is a reflection on what it is that's happening within the classroom. We want to help students to recognize that those errors that they make have often a whole lot of right in them, but we need to help them take apart what that looks like. What is the right that's embedded in some of the incorrect part of what it is that they're doing? That means as educators, we have to embrace the fact that when students make errors, that we are bumping up against that learning wall that's going to be able to crumble, that we are going to be able to push them through. That's a really important fork in the road for all of them. And doing that requires, in part, that you create the kind of climate where that's possible. One of the experiences that I think all of us are having in distance learning is the fact that students very often, when they're on camera, for example, feel a bit more awkward in front of their peers. They feel a little bit more hesitant for fear that they will make an error and somehow that will reflect poorly on them. It's really important for all of us to be able to bring that energy and to make sure that students know when we're together, we are learning together, and those errors are something that we absolutely must embrace. The second piece of that is around feedback. And feedback, as we know, is an important part of the learning process. Doug, can you go ahead and advance that? The feedback is multi-directional. Feedback is not simply having a tsunami of comments that overwhelm the student because they're all being generated from one direction, from teacher to student. Feedback goes in lots of different directions. There's, of course, feedback from the teacher to the student, but importantly, essentially, there needs to be feedback that happens from our students back to us. When they make errors, that's feedback to us. Feedback doesn't always come in the form of an exit slip or a question that's posed in the chat. When they make an error, recognize that's feedback that's happening right there. Feedback also happens across students. One of the practices that we have utilized for many, many years is what we call the helping curriculum. How do you create those opportunities for students to be able to engage in the kind of feedback and the willingness to be able to make errors if you're not embedding in everything you do those values and principles around how it is that we help? And so we pose for students every day, is there an opportunity where you have offered help to someone else? Have you asked for help? Have you accepted help? And were there any times where you politely declined help so that you could continue to try it for yourself? That's one of the ways that we help students to embrace this idea that errors are opportunities to learn, and that we create lots of conduits for feedback to happen among students and not simply coming from the teacher to the student. In a distance learning environment, feedback can also be invited in lots of different ways. So for example, in getting some feedback from students whenever we have a breakout room that happens, not just having a breakout room and having students that are engaged in a conversation or a discussion of one kind or another, but then also, once again, as John noted earlier, not just doing, but thinking about how your breakout room conversation went. Are there those opportunities to be able to rate that? That's feedback to us. Those are opportunities for students to be able to reflect on what it is that they know. We'll show you another example. So this is in the midst of a conversation among a small group of students who have been charged in the large group setting with figuring out, developing, co-creating, co-constructing what it means to be an A student, a B student, and a C student in a distance learning environment. And the students are actively engaged in co-constructing that, giving each other feedback about that, figuring out what are the practices that we need to expect from ourselves in order to be able to profit from the distance learning that's going on as well. So important, not just for the teacher to say, here's what an A is, here's what a B is, here's what a C is. Turn this over to students. What is it that we expect from ourselves? So we're going to ask you a question in the chat. What do we need to do to teach students to seek feedback in that distance learning environment? And Samantha immediately said, absolutely, modeling it. Modeling what it is that feedback looks like when we receive it. How we understand feedback when it comes to us. Building that rapport, absolutely. Making sure that there are those emotional connections that are there. Lots of thoughts about modeling, especially.
Mm-hmm.
It's so much of feedback is really dependent on the relationship between the people that are giving each other feedback.
Again, the chat is mesmerizing.
Yes.
Mesmerizing. Love it. Awesome. I could just keep, the chat's so interesting. I just keep reading and scrolling back up and missing them. I love it.
I think, Nancy, one of the things we'll find in COVID teaching is in regular classrooms, when you ask students what do they do when they don't know, the majority of students say they put their hand up. Watch them. No, they don't. The kids who put their hands up are the kids who know the answer. The beauty of social media is that you're more likely to have students ask you about what they don't know and tell you they don't know. And so that's a really good notion of using that social media. And I really hope, everybody, that you learn from this question about how students seek feedback in COVID teaching. So when you come back to the regular classroom, you can mimic it and not go back to giving the message that if you put your hand up, make sure you know the right answer, not the right way of doing it.
Awesome. So cool. So many things to think about. So we've gone through, okay, you got to know where you are. You got to know where you're going. You got to learn to choose some learning tools, and you have to figure out how to seek feedback from other people. We are starting to see in distance learning peer cross-age tutoring. Now that didn't happen in the pandemic teaching of March, April, May, but in the last couple of weeks, I'm starting to see like 4th and 5th graders having time to go and tutor kindergarten or 1st graders and 2nd graders. And that has not happened yet in distance learning. It is new. It's so interesting that we're figuring out all these ways to get kids to teach each other. We're also seeing, some people are calling it waterfall chat, some people are calling it other things, inclusive chat. We're seeing a thing now, this started about 3 weeks ago, where the teacher says, so let's pretend it's this question. What do we need to teach students to see feedback? Type your answer in the chat. Do not hit return. Do not hit send. They just have it ready in the chat. So then they say 1, 2, 3, and everybody puts it at once. It's so interesting to see this cascade of chat all simultaneously, because we're hearing that some students are waiting for the first 3 students to respond, literally copying it, dropping it into the chat, hitting return, and now I've participated. And so waterfall chat or inclusive chat started about 3 weeks ago. It's spreading all over now. Oh, nitro chat, I love that. That's so fun. See, chat flurries. See, that's what's so cool is we're rapidly sharing innovation with each other like I've never seen before. The next area is helping students monitor their progress so that they can adjust their learning. And teachers need to provide tools for chatvalence. I love it. I love it. So how do we provide tools to help students monitor their progress? And this is becoming a very big thing here in San Diego. Like, how do we make sure students have this this idea? How do they know how to monitor? One of the reasons we are waiting on the chat and having kids type it in is because it's leaving kids back who need think time. So if you need thinking time and my teacher says this is how long you have before you hit send, it's really helping some of the students because some kids are jumping in right away. So back to monitoring progress. So here's one tool. This teacher said, in my slide deck, I'm going to have this partner talk rubric because I want students to know how to monitor when they go to a breakout room and talk to each other. This is grade 3. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to create level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. And I'm going to teach students what each level looks like so that they can then monitor where they are when they go to their breakout rooms. I saw in the chat earlier single point rubrics. Here's an example of a single point rubric. This happens to be math and it's written as glows and grows. How can I strengthen my work? Where do I need to grow still? And where am I strong in this work? Here's another single point rubric around writing. How do I notice areas that needed work and evidence that I've exceeded the work expectation so far? And imagine students using these tools, these single point rubrics, to monitor their progress and then have conversations with their teachers about, here's where I think I'm at, here's what I think I still need to learn. We're also seeing, this is now spreading everywhere, a no-show chart. So there's a success criteria at the top, and the science teacher says to the students, in the no column, list all of the things that you now know based on that success criteria. And in the show column, how could you show the things that you know? Imagine all the different ways, ideas, students have been like, here are all the things I know, here are the ways I can show. So here's an example from a high school anatomy, physiology, life science teacher. I grabbed one student off of Google. Here's her work. She's the only one that wrote about this in the whole class. She wrote about warts. That's what she chose. I love the no-show strategy. I think it's so cool. Here's another one from history. Now this student changed the top, how I can prove it. That's not what the teacher said. It was called a no-show chart, but this student said, I can prove it. And this teacher, his name's Tyler. Tyler has his students old school, write their no-show chart, take a photo, put it in the chat for him, and then he chooses one of them for them to actually go and show. So here are all the things you know, and here's all the things that you can show, and I would like to see this one from you. Imagine all the students having all the different knows, all the different shows, And then Tyler saying, hey, I want to see this, I want to see this, I want to see this, I want to see this from you. Student ownership, student responsibility, and them showing their learning in ways that they've identified. As another teacher, I know the old school paper, right? Not everything needs to be digitized just because we're learning from a distance. There's nothing wrong with having kids' eyes away from the computer screen, writing things down, holding it up to their camera, snapping it, transferring it in the file. So this is an exit from an English teacher. And he simply says, you know, how confident do you feel about the lesson? What did you learn today? And then he asks students to do a quick video clip, Flipgrid, of their learning. So you can get a sense, like an exit slip, but on video. So here's Joaquin's.
So today in class, we reviewed the hero's journey type of story. We've talked about other stories that it is included in, like The Hobbit, Harry Potter, and those other types of stories. And we read an article on dystopian stories and that type of sci-fi. And on a scale of 1 to 5, I feel like a 5 on what I know. Yeah.
Here's another student, same class. Here's her Zoom exit poll and her comments, and then her video.
Hi, I'm Trinitynsley. I am in Mr. Dale's class, English 1. And today we learned about where we could find both literary criticism and archetype lens in film, books, and maybe even in TED Talks, along with many others. In the description, both words and how they were used, so we were able to learn what it meant, so what literary criticism meant, along with archetypal lens. And then we even learned how the user's guide to 7 characters, which is also archetype lens. And it actually kind of reminded me in 8th grade about the hero's journey. And in fact, we even learned that today as well. So yeah, that's really it.
Awesome. Here's another idea. So this teacher said, here's a test. I've given this test. My entire department has given this test. It's on plagiarism and attribution of sources. It's a test that we give because we want to document that students have been told and learned about plagiarism and attribution of sources. So she says to them, this year, you have to take the test. But you know they could Google every one of these answers. I'm not going to grade your multiple choice test. You do have to take it. You have to give it a good shot. Your score is going to be based on the maximum 500 words that you write to me about what you learned about plagiarism and attribution of sources. And when I talked to her about this, she said, I don't think my students Googled the answer because they got a lot of them wrong. And it really helped me think about where my teaching was. And then I got to read their responses about what they learned inside their essays about what they learned about plagiarism and attribution of sources. And in fact, they used evidence from the test that they had just read inside their written responses because they actually learned something during the process of reading the test. This math teacher said, here's what I'm going to do. This test has completely, totally been finished. The test is all done. Here it is. Students, here's the test. It's completely done. Your job is to figure out if the person who did it right. And if not, what caused the errors. And he said, it is so easy to make different errors in different versions. And they had to do an error analysis. And when I talked to him, he said, I will never go back to old kinds of tests. My students need to learn error analysis to think about the thinking of another person. So he says, I'm giving tests that have already been completed, and I can change different errors in different places, and I can look inside my students' minds and see, do they understand the thinking of other people? Some 4th and 5th grade teachers created a retelling rubric for Flipgrid. And they said, when my students read science and history text, what I want them to do is retell it to me. Because if they retell on Flipgrid, I know if their parents are coaching them. I know if they're reading a web page. So once they read something, I want them to tell the information back to me so I can think about, oh, that student is understanding this. So what other ideas? What other ideas do you have to build monitoring tools that you could provide your students so they have some responsibility to monitor their own learning? Portfolios, thank you. Sketch note. Can you teach it? Reflective journal. Padlet, progress logs. Doodling Jamboard, journals, digital notebooks, journals. This is making me think. Error analysis, awesome. Super cool. Okay, Nancy, let me know when you're ready, because I'm just gonna read the chat. I'm loving the chat.
I'm ready when you are.
All right. Defend my claim, response boards. I can barely leave the chat. Goal setting guides.
Well, and that brings us to a really essential part of what it is that we're really looking at with student mind frames. And as John had noted earlier, a measure of the thinking that students are doing is when they not only recognize their own learning, but that they can teach other people about their learning as well. You know, the chat has been going by so quickly, John and Doug, and I don't know whether you saw, there was a wonderful suggestion in the chat that comes from Howie Hua. I hope I'm saying pronouncing the name correctly. And after every couple of problems or discussions that they have, that he'll ask in the chat, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident do you feel about what we just did? And then he calls on a high number and asks that person, what's a tip that you would give to someone who is not yet comfortable with it? And I love that idea of students in the moment teaching one another, really getting them to be able to consider what it is that they know. An aspect of this as well is in students taking that information, recognizing what it is that they've learned and turning it into their very own kind of learning. We're going to show you a quick video clip from a small group reading instruction that students did. Doug, can you go ahead and advance that?
Yep, so this teacher entered their lit circle, their lit club, book club, I guess, to get them to decide how they were going to demonstrate their learning.
This is her in real life, not illustration, right? This is her. I wanted to show that with you guys. And to kind of wrap up, I want you to choose one of these 2 prompts. So prompt 1, what are you passionate about and how can you create change? Or what does Malala inspire you to do? And I would like you to write your answer in the chat box. So I want you to think for a second though, what are you passionate about? It doesn't have to be related or the same that Malala was passionate about. What are you passionate about? And what could you do to create change? And then, or if you want to answer, what does Malala inspire you to do? So this is.
I love the expression on the students' faces too, as they're really warming up to that idea, that opportunity to be able to take control of their own learning, to let them have those chances, those opportunities to make the learning their own. Many times when we're talking with students about, especially engaging with complex text, for example, of one kind or another, we ask them this question: what does that text inspire you to be able to do? And there are lots of ways that the student can make this their own through presentations, debates, writing, Socratic seminar, and so on. But we wanted to share with you a kindergartner's version of this. they had just read the book, The Days the Crayon Quit, which Doug has often defined as being the greatest book ever written.
Oh, right, Tiffany? Right, Tiffany?
Right? It is a wonderful book. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, the crayons are having conflict with one another. The entire book is filled with each of the crayons writing to their owner, Duncan, about what their beef is that they have with another crayon, or how it is that they're used or not used, and so on. And of course, this captured the imagination of these kindergartners. And their teacher posed to them, in particular, what does this text inspire you to do? And so in some cases, there were a couple of students who started Googling images, and they put onto their board all the different ways that the sun was being portrayed. Is it orange or is it yellow? That was one of the conflicts that was in the story. Here's another student, again, writing on good old-fashioned paper and holding it up to the camera. And she says, and we did a little interpreting here, how about you and orange both be the color of the sun? I love this child's creativity, seeing herself as a peacemaker, seeing herself as someone who can find ways to be able to bring those two together. And Doug, do you recall there was another little girl in the class that wrote her whole story about her shoes in her bedroom closet not getting along with each other as well?
Yep. And I see Jessica, the day the markers quit, the day there was no glue. And she wrote all about her shoes. And it was hysterical. And the yellow one said, don't take me outside. I don't want to get wet. I love it. Super awesome.
So one more chat for all of you. When do your students get a chance to teach each other? How do you go about making sure that that happens in a distance learning environment? Yeah, those breakout rooms are absolutely critical.
Nancy, there's a district in Northern California that started Teach Back Tuesday. And every Tuesday, kids got to teach their family members things they had learned the previous week. And parents started talking about all the things they were learning. One parent I interviewed said, a mom said, I kind of forgot how to divide fractions. I totally get it again. I heard about appreciation of the arts. I heard about history. I heard about English language development. That Teach Back Tuesday became a thing, that kids got to teach family members things they had learned. We had a fifth grader in the district who he said, I don't have to teach it if they already know it. I think that's super smart for a fifth grader. I don't have to teach it because if they already know it. Now, John could probably comment on how many teachers teach things kids already know. But anyway, so he wrote little math problems, and if his parents couldn't do them, he would teach them. But he made them do the math problems first, fifth grade.
Love that.
So that kind of brings us to the point today where we're going to look at this major theme that we're trying to get across about how we can teach students the thinking tools, the teaching skills, the learning tools to keep going. And we invite you also. I would hope that during this COVID teaching that you yourselves keep a learning log about what works really well, so that when we do come back to the regular class, you can bring back better. Maybe we need to think of it in terms of a know and show, our own know and show about what's working, what doesn't work. And certainly, as we've seen today, that incredible involvement from your peers with those great ideas in the chat. There is so much learning going on there about how we can use COVID kind of like a golden ticket to refresh our teaching, to realize and remember that it's about students understanding about what they know and what they don't know, about how students can become their own teachers. And that's why these mind frames that we've talked about today are so critical to remember. And it's kind of like for you here on this webinar, there was about 3,000 of you at one point on this webinar, and we were all speaking to you individually. That doesn't happen in a regular class.
No.
And that's the power that we want to optimize, that each student thinks they're being talked to individually, and you will get to know your students in quite different ways, because you're going to hear a lot more about how they think and what their mind frames are. So take this as an incredible opportunity to refresh about how we teach, and we ask you to keep your own know and show so that when we do come back to a regular class, we can bring back so much better with this new way of thinking about learning.
Well, thank you so much, John, Doug, and Nancy. This has been so informative. A lot of information, a lot of great comments in the chat. I just wanted to get on just real quick here. A couple reminders that we will be sending an email out in the next few days with the recording, with the PowerPoint slides, with your certificate of attendance. And if we can manage to save the chat and send it out, we will send that out to everybody as well. Now I'm showing you the 4 books in our distance learning playbook collection. So the first one is the one that was mostly the content from today's presentation was from this first one with Doug, John, and Nancy as authors on that. And then as Doug mentioned earlier, they all partnered with Rosalind Wiseman for Distance Learning Playbook for Parents. So if you know any parents, if you are parents, this is a great book to help you guide your family and your students through this distance learning time. It is available on corwin.com/the Distance Learning Playbook. It will be available shortly on Amazon, but they are a little bit behind Corwin getting it, but you can definitely send people to corwin.com for now and Amazon within the next week. The Distance Learning Playbook for college and university instruction for college faculty is also available at Corwin.com. And then the Distance Learning Playbook for school leaders, which combines these same authors with Dominique Smith, will be publishing October 15th, but there are pre-orders available on Corwin.com for that book as well. And then also we have quite a few services offerings, if we go to the next slide, on these same distance learning playbook series. So again, that information is available at corwin.com/the Distance Learning Playbook. And then for another type of interaction with the authors, we have Camp Corwin book clubs. The first one regarding the Parents Playbook is coming up on October 6th and 8th, and you can register for those, reserve your spot at corwin.com/Corwin Book Club. Send any parents you know to that website. They can sign up and join us for the Parents Book Club. Then we have another book club that Nancy and Doug will be hosting on their newest literacy title called Comprehension, and that book club is on October 13th and 15th. Again, at the same website, corwin.com/Corwin Book Club is where you can register. And then finally, one last book club with these 3 great presenters, with Dominique joining them on November 17th and 19th for anyone who's involved in school leadership. So we'll be covering the Distance Learning Playbook for school leaders. Once again, thank you all so much for your time. I think we have a couple minutes left if anyone has any final comments or questions that we can address right now.
Thank you for your nice words, everybody. Thank you. You will get the PowerPoint and the recording via email. And then they're working on getting the chat because there's some permissions issues that we have to think about for that. The book clubs are free, no cost to join the book clubs. Thank you much.
Thank you.